Ladies and gentlemen, it's getting cold outside. It's that time of year. And I'm not gonna lie, one of the most anxiety-inducing things that I've faced when backpacking, for some reason, is just always worrying that I'm gonna be freezing cold at night anytime the temperatures dip below like 45 degrees. I'm always questioning whether or not the gear I brought is gonna be suitable for those colder temperatures. But at the same time, I never wanna bring a bunch of extra gear to ensure that I'm gonna be warm because, well, ultralights. Yeah, I'm one of those ultralight douchebags, okay? So I don't want to bring a bunch of extra weight just to keep me warm. So as a result, over the years, I've discovered a bunch of tiny little ways that I can stretch my gear system to keep me as warm as possible as the temperatures dip. Now, I'm not gonna stand here and promise that these tips are gonna be able to make you take your 3-season setup and stretch it all the way down to like negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Obviously, there is gonna be a temperature limit. At some point, it's gonna be cold enough that you're just gonna have to bring some extra gear or bring some heavier, warmer gear. But I don't think a lot of people realize that you can actually get a lot more out of your normal, say, 3-season-ish setup in terms of the temperatures that you can sleep comfortably at. So here's 10 tips that are gonna help you sleep warm all night without adding a bunch of extra weight to your gear system. Tip number 1 is to start a fire inside of your tent or hammock. I'm just kidding. The real first tip is to change into all your warm clothes and get inside of your sleeping bag or quilt before you get too cold at camp. I don't really know the science behind this, but it's kind of common sense, right? Like once your body temperature cools down enough, once you start to get really cold, even if you put all your warm stuff on and get inside your bag, it's gonna take longer for you to warm up. If you can get ahead of the game a little bit and put all that warm stuff on, get nice and cozy inside your bag before you're like shivering and before you're freezing cold, you're gonna be a lot more comfortable and you're probably gonna fall asleep a lot easier. The next tip is to utilize all of your clothing when you're sleeping on these cold nights. That might sound like kind of obvious, like no why wouldn't you get into all your clothing? But hear me out. I mean literally all of your clothing, because there's a good chance that you're carrying some things that you could be wearing at night that you haven't really thought about using. For instance, your hiking clothes. Now, some of you ultralight douchebags that are even more ultralight douchebaggy than me probably only sleep in your hiking clothes, but a lot of us carry an extra set of clothing to wear when we're sleeping. And so if you do that, you have an entire other set of clothing that you could put on to go to sleep in your hiking clothes. Yeah, they're gonna be smelly, they're gonna be gross like that, but if you really need that extra warmth, it's a good thing to consider. Another piece of clothing to consider wearing is your rain jacket. That's one I think a lot of people tend to forget about. Put your rain jacket on before you go to bed. Yeah, it's not gonna be like the most comfortable thing, but it is gonna hold in a lot of heat and give you that extra warmth. The next tip to help you sleep warm when you're backpacking, and this requires no extra gear at all, is to sleep on your side. Now, this one is purely anecdotal. I don't know if there's any actual science to back this up, but I certainly have noticed, this was honestly the first tip I thought of when I started making this video. I've noticed that I sleep much warmer on my side. Again, I'm not really sure why, honestly. If you know or if you've noticed this yourself, maybe leave a comment, but I'm guessing it's maybe because you're a little bit more like balled up and maybe that just helps you stay warmer, or maybe because there's less of your body on your sleeping pad and so there's less surface area that's gonna get cold. Again, I don't really know, but I've definitely noticed that I sleep way warmer on my side. I know that everyone sleeps in a slightly different configuration, so maybe you just can't ever fall asleep on your side and you're just like totally screwed, I don't know. But if you can stand at all to sleep on your side and you're worried about staying warm at night, it's definitely worth giving it a try. The next tip to stay warm when you're sleeping is to fucking smash that subscribe button, dude. Woo! I want to get this channel to 50,000 subscribers, so if you haven't subscribed already and you're watching a lot of these videos, hit that subscribe button. Okay, this next tip comes down to campsite selection. Now, I'm sure that you've heard this one before, but it's so important that I'm going to just drill it into you. Campsite selection is super important. And again, I know that depending on the circumstances, you might not always be able to choose the optimal campsite, but if you can help it, or if you can plan and you know it's gonna be a really cold night, try to find a campsite that is low in elevation and is sheltered from the wind. Obviously, say you're in a hammock and there's a bunch of wind that's just blowing underneath your hammock all night, you're gonna be a lot colder. Even in a tent, there's always gonna be some ways that some breeze and some air and some wind can get through. So this is really, really important. Maybe even consider setting up your tent or your hammock in a way that's gonna block the wind the most. I know this is tedious stuff and most of the time you're really tired and you just wanna throw up your tent and, you know, friggin' eat and then jerk off and pass out, but I think I make too many jokes about jerking off, honestly. It's important to consider this stuff if it's gonna be a really, really cold night. The next tip, honestly, is a pretty obvious one, but it's worth mentioning. Drink something hot before you go to bed. I'm talking like right before you go to bed. Once everything is settled, get out your stove, make some tea. You could do some hot chocolate. If you're a psycho, you could do coffee even though you're about to go to bed. For me personally, I like to just drink a nice cup of warm piss right before bed. No, I don't, but having some warm liquids inside of you, there's a lot of jokes I can make about that line. It's gonna warm your body temperature up. It's gonna make you feel nice and cozy, nice and snug, and it's gonna help you stay warm as you're falling asleep. And along this same line, this next tip is to eat a hot meal before you go to bed. Some of you don't carry stoves, although to be honest with you, if you're crazy enough that you don't carry a stove, you're probably not watching these backpacking tip videos anyways, or you probably are actually. Leave a comment if you're one of those idiots. But assuming you have a stove, having a nice warm meal inside of your body, there I go again. It's gonna help you stay warm as you're falling asleep. This is another tip that I've definitely noticed has made a big difference for me. Again, I don't really know the science behind it. I'm assuming your body starts digesting a little bit. It just kind of warms you up. And it's important that you do this like right before you go to bed or shortly thereafter. I know some people probably can't fall asleep like immediately after eating a big meal, but try to eat it as close to bedtime as you possibly can. Eat that Get inside your quilt, get inside your sleeping bag. It's gonna help you fall asleep faster. It's gonna help you stay warm. This next one has to do with your rain fly on your tent, or if you're in a hammock, I guess your tarp. I know a lot of people tend to sleep with their rain flies open when it's not raining, and this makes sense. You know, you want that airflow. It's gonna help reduce condensation. It's nice, you can kind of see out a little bit, maybe look at the stars or whatever. But if it's really, really cold outside and you're kind of worried that like, oh shit, I might freeze my nuts off, it's gonna help a little bit if that rain fly is closed. Again, I don't know anything about anything, so I'm not really sure. I'm assuming it's because it just kind of holds in some of the heat, but I've definitely noticed on those cold mornings when I first get outside of my tent and I open up the rain fly that the temperature outside the tent is colder than the temperature inside the tent, I guess, because it just holds in the heat a little bit better. And again, this can help block some of the wind that might be ripping into your tent as well. Another tip to keep you nice and warm and not have to carry a bunch of weight is to cinch your sleeping bag or your quilt up as tight against your body as you possibly can. And again, I know some of you might understand this already, but I'm not gonna lie, it took me an alarming amount of time to realize that the cinches on the top of your quilts or sleeping bags exist for a reason. You're gonna get nice and snug in there, and when you cinch it down like that, it's gonna hold in a lot more of your body heat, and it's gonna keep you a lot warmer at night. Another thing you can do, assuming your quilt or your sleeping bag is big enough, is you can actually pull the top of it completely over your head. Again, maybe this isn't the most comfortable thing in the world, but when it's really, really cold, you're probably gonna wanna get as much warmth as you possibly can. And I found that, especially when I'm laying on my side, because it's a little easier to kind of ball up, if I pull my quilt over my head, again, I guess it just traps in even more body heat, and it helps me stay a lot warmer. This is one that I reserve for pretty much the coldest of the cold nights, but it definitely adds some warmth, and it's a good thing to keep in mind, dude. The next tip, and this is probably one of the most obvious, but also probably the most important tip for staying warm at night. For the love of God, keep your gear dry. This is so important because if your gear gets wet, especially your down, if you have a down sleeping bag or quilt and that shit gets wet, you are kind of screwed. Down loses its insulating property when it's wet. And so if it's freezing cold and your quilt or even your jacket like this gets wet, that's bad news. I could do a whole other video on how to keep your gear dry, but just some quick tips for this. We're gonna do tips inside of this tip. Don't rely on pack covers. That shit sucks. Use a pack liner, like a trash compactor bag or one of those Nylafoam pack liners, or just anything that's waterproof, honestly. Use that and keep all of your like essential gear in there, your sleeping bag, your camp clothes, your warm clothes, anything that's really important to keep you warm, keep it in that pack liner. And also just be mindful of handling your gear when you're around camp, if it's raining or if it's the ground and the trees and stuff is just wet. Because even if it's not like pouring rain, if you're careless and when you're packing up and stuff, you might accidentally drop some of your stuff on the ground and it might pick up some of the moisture from the ground. So you really need to keep your freaking gear dry. And for this next tip, we all know how much it sucks to get out of your warm, cozy sleeping bag when it's freezing cold outside and go to the bathroom. It's literally the worst thing, getting out of your tent in the middle of the night, especially when it's cold, because you're just like so warm and and you're so snug. Then you have to go out into the elements, go out where it's freezing cold, and you're gonna lose all that warm air that's accumulated inside your sleeping bag. Dude, take a piss before you go to sleep. I mean, like literally right before. The last thing you do, force yourself to pee. Now, obviously, sometimes you're gonna have to get up and piss no matter what, but if you really try to force yourself to take a piss right before you go to bed, right before you get into your sleeping bag, that could potentially prevent you from having to get out in the middle of the night. This could also be said for just like arranging your gear. Like there's been times before where I've been lazy before I went to bed and I left some of my gear scattered out. And then in the middle of the night, say it started to rain or for whatever reason, I started to get paranoid about how I left my gear out. And then I have to get out and I have to go fix it in the middle of the night and I lost all my warmth that was in my sleeping bag. You don't want to do that. Make sure all your stuff is organized. Just eliminate any reason that you would have to get out of your bag once you're inside for the night. I want to have the warmest sleeping subscribers on YouTube, so if you're not subscribed, once more, hit that subscribe button, subscribe, and stay warm out there, guys. Leave some other tips for staying warm in the comments, and I'll see you next time.